1 Kings chapter 11. What have we just recently kind of discussed, just by way of reminder, coming out of 1 Kings chapter 10, leading us up to this point? Solomon's great wealth. Absolutely. What else? What are some of the things we recognize about Solomon that he was doing with all this great wealth? All kinds. Almost seemed as if there was just so much they could just do what they pleased with it. And to your statement, he made shields. He made several hundred shields with great amounts of gold that were put into each one of these, made gold vessels for them to drink out of, all kinds of things that this gold was being used for. And when you read through chapter 10 and you really look at everything that's being stated that was taking place as far as the wealth of this kingdom, you know, I don't want to come away from it entirely with a negative focus, because one of the bigger things in there that we need to recognize was God said he was going to bless them. And he blessed them abundantly. He upheld his end, right? He blessed them so greatly that they had never reached a point like this as a nation, as a kingdom, and here they are. But the things that we do pick up on that are negative when you look at chapter 10 is the fact of what they were using this gold for, and the fact that they were just stockpiling it, essentially. Now, when we look at some of the old law, and we will in this class today, it tells us that they were not to collect up for themselves multitudes and multitudes of gold, but that's exactly what they were doing. So coming out of 1 Kings chapter 10, I don't want us to be entirely focused on the negative, because there is great blessings that came from God, and it's seen in how wealthy, how prosperous, and how mighty this kingdom is. But I do think that a lot of the things that we discussed and where Solomon's heart was turning was the beginning of this downfall. It was the beginning of this downward spiral, if you will, of Solomon. And that's what we're fixing to see. It's like he was on his way down in the previous chapter, and now he's flat out. He's taken the fall once we come into chapter 11. So let's go ahead and let's read 1 Kings chapter 11. If someone will, go ahead and read the first 6 verses for us.
But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David.
Thank you, sir. All right, this first little section here, the first 6 verses, we're going to recognize it as accepting idolatry. Now, when you come out of chapter 10 and everything that was stated, and all of this gathering up and collecting of gold, collecting of chariots, of horses, and all those things that were mentioned in the previous chapter, then you come into chapter 11, and the very first verse says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women." Now, it may sound as if there is a contrast being made here, like, okay, you have all of these things, but then you have this here. Well, some translations actually render it as now. Now Solomon loved many foreign women. It's almost in the sense like it's a continuation. Like we've already seen this list of all these things that he's stockpiling, and now it's almost a continuation when you come into chapter 11. Now Solomon loved many foreign women. And it's continuing almost the same thought in this idea that he is almost not content with just a little bit, but he has to have a ton. Yes, sir. I covered it? I'm sorry. You can cover it again if you want to. Okay. Sorry about that. So, one of the things, you know, when you come into this chapter, and thinking about everything that we read in the previous, and it's almost like, okay, well, all of these other things were not enough. You know what I mean? Everything that he multiplied up, and all this gold, and all the horses, the chariots, the army, all of this, and it's like it was not enough. And then it moves right into this harem, into all of his wives and all of his concubines. And in the same sense, it's like it just wasn't enough. He continues to have more than everybody else in just about all things, it seemed. One, sir?
The pattern of excess.
Pattern of excess, absolutely. It's almost like everything he had to have it in great abundance. One writer said this: as he exceeded all other kings in glory, wisdom, and power, so must he excel them, not only in armies, chariots, and horses, but also in the number of wives. Do you think that pride might have been part of Solomon's problem with all of this excess of things, possibly? I think it very well could have. The lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, right? These things very well could have been a problem or part of the issue with Solomon and everything he desired. Yes, sir?
I was just going to say, to sort of paraphrase something my dad used to say, he stopped thinking with his mind and started thinking with his lustful heart.
Seems to be the case. You know, and I wonder, and the more times I've read through this chapter and trying to tie it back with the flow of thought that was in the previous chapter, a lot of it I see as that right there. And then part of it I also seem to think it may be just another way of him saying, you know what, look at me, and I have more than everybody else, in some sense. I don't know if I can prove that, but it does seem to be the case. But definitely, I think that does tie along with it also. Well, it says Solomon loved many foreign women as well as the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, even in this verse right here, in verse 1, where it states that Solomon loved many foreign women as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, the translating of this statement varies from translation to translation. In the New King James, like we just read, as well as, in the American Standard or in the New American Standard, it says Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh. The King James Version says Solomon loved many foreign women together with the daughter of Pharaoh. And I wonder, when I read through this, what is the significance of it actually pointing back to Pharaoh's daughter, the one whom we saw him marry in 1 Kings chapter 3, and then you have all of these other wives. Is there a reason that it's being specified this way, where you have, okay, here's his first wife, and then here's all the multitude? Is there some reason or something that we should catch here when we see this separation like that? Is it the case that all of the wives altogether are the problem? Or is it the case that just these other wives are the problem? Could this first one, the Pharaoh's daughter, could that just be a lawful wife who was not causing all the problem, but rather all of these others that he continued to take up after the fact? Possibly. Hard to say, right? I don't know. I was just curious that when you come into this text, why it kind of shows a distinction there. Many other women besides the daughter of Pharaoh, and specifies her. I want to look at a few verses just to bring our minds back, kind of what we talked about in 1 Kings chapter 3. We'll read a handful of verses just to remind us, because was this marriage with Pharaoh's daughter unlawful? Think so? I've always thought it in the past. Since I've studied through this go-around for this class, I started to wonder a little bit. And we'll look at some of the verses and I'll kind of explain my reasoning, but I don't know that it was ever actually condemned that we have in Scripture about this relationship he had with Pharaoh's daughter. And we'll go back and let's look at some verses just to kind of build on that thought as we work through this. Exodus chapter 34, verses 10 through 16. Exodus chapter 34. Verses 10 through 16, if someone will please read that.
He said, behold, I make a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as have not been done in all of the earth, nor in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord. For it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst, but you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifice to their gods. And one of them invites you to eat of his sacrifice. And you take of his daughter for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods.
All right, thank you. Who is it that was actually being spoken of in this commandment that was given to Israel? And we looked at this a little bit when we came into 1 Kings chapter 3, because I was trying to discern whether or not that first marriage, if that was an unlawful marriage, that when he married Pharaoh's daughter. If you notice in this text, basically what's being stated, when you go into the promised land, when you go into that land that you're going to receive, these inhabitants that are making up that land right now, when you go in there, you're not to have any kind of relationship with them. So when you go into the land of Canaan, you have absolutely no ties with these nations. You go in, you destroy any of their altars. You do not allow them to intermarry with your children, nor your children to them. Do not have those kind of relationships. We're not going to have any part to do with them. All right, let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7, the first 5 verses. It reads, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you, and the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars and break down their sacred pillars and cut down their wooden images and burn their carved images with fire." Again, the statement that's being made here, when you go into the promised land, you're going to remove all of these people. You're going to get rid of them, destroy them, destroy anything and everything that has anything to do with idolatry when you go into Canaan. That was their responsibility. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder, is it talking about, because we see with Ruth, when she married Boaz, she was a foreigner, but she converted. And so, does it have to do with the fact that these foreign wives were known for idolatry?
I think that plays a big part in it. And when we came into chapter 3 and first looked at Pharaoh's daughter and that marriage, we discussed a little bit about the fact that they would come in and there were certain steps, and we actually looked at some of the old law and what the woman had to do, basically. It was this 30-day process where she was, okay, I'm putting away that of my old beliefs and lifestyle, and now I'm going to live under this, law. And it's almost as if they could be accepted in, right? And it seemed to always be the case. The foreign wives in these nations, I think, there was so much idolatry in this area, it was known that that would be the end result by taking on all of these wives. So I definitely think it has a big part to play in it. There in Deuteronomy, go ahead and go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Now this is more specific to the kings. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17, if someone will read verse 14 through 17.
When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord hath said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself.
Thank you. Verse 16 and 17, we immediately begin to think about the things that took place in the previous chapter and now also coming into chapter 11 with the multiplying up so many wives. So we see him doing these things that he should have known that were against the law, but now he's taking on more and more and more and breaking more and more of these laws. Well, again, it was stated that they were not to go back to Egypt. They were not to have any kind of relationships with the people that they were going into the land there in Canaan. But it never necessarily specified anything about a lady from Egypt. I don't know if there's anything to that. I wondered that when we came into chapter 3. And I'll show you why. Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 3. Hold your spot there in Deuteronomy 17 and turn to 1 Kings chapter 3. Just by way of reminder, and this is kind of what we discussed when we got to 1 Kings chapter 3. But there at verse 1, the first 3 verses, and here's why I wonder if it wasn't the case that that first marriage was a lawful marriage and the rest beyond that were the problem. Chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, Now King Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in his statutes, walking in the statutes of his father David. Now, right to that point, it sounds like everything that Solomon has done there in chapter 3 is okay. It doesn't sound as if it's being condemned in any fashion. It says all this, it follows that up with Solomon loved the Lord, walking in his statutes, as did his father David, except, there's the except in there. Okay, now here's everything that he had done, except, and now here's what had been going wrong. That he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. There was a location, a place that was going to be built, and Solomon did build that, and we saw that, the temple, right? That's the place where they were going to offer up sacrifices. But the thing stated before that, it doesn't seem to condemn it. So I don't know. I just question it. Yes?
But that because of the right to marry. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at when he said don't marry the inhabitants of the land, and he brings up because of their false gods and stuff like that. And then if you think about Samson, when he saw that woman from Timnah that he wanted, and his parents said, or at least his father said, you know, you can't find somebody amongst your brethren to marry. And it was because of, you know, they worship the false gods and stuff like that. So I'm just thinking, because, you know, that's what they did, is they went up in those high places and they sacrificed to those false gods.
Right.
So what would cause him to do that?
As far as the sacrifices he was making then?
Yeah.
At this point, where he was going was a common place they would go, because they haven't actually established the temple, the altar that's there, the threshing floor that David purchased. That ultimately would be where everything would be built, but up until this point, it had not been built yet. So it's almost like Solomon, okay, here's your responsibility. Here's why you need to get busy doing this, because they're still offering sacrifices over here. I need you to be over here. So,
You're doing the right thing in the wrong place.
right. That's the way I've understood it. I just wondered when we first came into chapter 3 as to why it throws that except in there in verse 3, because it almost sounds as if the things stated in verse 1 and 2 in the first part of 3 are okay. And then it says except, here's what he was doing wrong. Maybe I'm reading that wrong. I'm not saying this is concrete. I'm just curious because it again separates Pharaoh's daughter from all the other wives the way it states it. So I don't know.
I never picked up on that before. I just never read this before. I just assumed this is why.
Right.
But I never did pick up on the separation of the
Right.
wife. But then talk about not his marriage being lawful. I mean, if that was his first wife that he married, I mean, I'm thinking all the others would not be.
Right. And that's kind of where I'm kind of caught there trying to determine which it is. And I'm not taking a concrete stand. I haven't found anything that really condemns Solomon for what's stated in verses 1 through 3, other than that last part of it. Well, if you go back and look there at Deuteronomy 17, I think here it kind of answers a lot of the problems that Solomon was having. Deuteronomy chapter 17, picking up where we left off there in verse 18, it says, Also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests and the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right nor to the left, and that he may prolong the days of his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. I don't know if it was the case that at this point in his life, maybe with all these things that he had become so focused on, that maybe he was a little bit less focused on his responsibility to God, possibly. I don't know. But it's like you see all this great and all this good things that Solomon did, and then once you get to chapter 10 and then coming into chapter 11, it's just like, bam, somebody slammed the brakes, and all of a sudden things have changed and changed for the worse, and they've changed very fast. And now, there in 1 Kings chapter 11, it's stating that all these wives are the exact thing that pulled his heart away from God. I don't know. I still question when I go through the text, was that first one wrong or right? Beforehand, even before going into school, I always leaned to the thought that it was wrong. I always thought that was just something he did right off the bat that was wrong, and I couldn't understand why it wasn't, addressed immediately. So I don't know. I wonder. Regardless, by the time you get to chapter 11, the first thing that's said there is, here's your issue, Solomon. You have taken for yourself so many foreign wives. All of these foreign wives from all of these different nations, which we just saw in the old law, he was not to have any kind of relationship with. And now it's fixing to cause all kind of problem for all of the nation. So, it says, women of the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites. Again, I question, was Pharaoh's daughter, was that a lawful wife? I don't know. The more I look at it, possibly. If she had converted all the way over in a sense, maybe so. All right. There in verse 2 it says, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. The warning was there. Solomon understood it. There's no doubt. He had every warning that he needed continually about what his responsibility was and that which he was not supposed to do. And all the things that were going on in his life and everything that he had, all these foreign wives would be the thing. It says he clings to them in love. And all the while, God's the one who has blessed him so greatly. God is the one who has gave him this kingdom, put him in this position, made this kingdom so wealthy, so powerful, and all this. And then all of a sudden, you would hope to see Solomon clinging to God. But it's the exact opposite. Yes.
I just find it interesting that he's the wisest man ever lived, and this is not even wisdom that was imparted to him. This is a common sense thing that was given to everybody in Israel, and he failed at it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you don't even have to be smart to really understand it. He just
Right.
tells it, and he explains the whole thing. It's not just like that, just because I said so. He tells you exactly why. And so all these other things he had in his grasp to understand, this was simple and he didn't get it.
Right. You can have all the wisdom in the world, but if you don't have the motivation to do what's right, what good is it? And he was given every bit of it. Do you think these are the only things, you think about the things in the previous chapter, and I know we're spending a lot of time right here on the start of chapter 11, but I kind of wanted to intentionally just because this is a major turning point for Israel. Do you think this was the only things? We talked about the chariots, we talked about the gold, we talked about the women. Are these the only things you think that he multiplied up for himself? Probably not, right? It seems like very much a pattern of who he was or who he had become, wanting excess of everything. You realize that these numbers that it gives us there in verse 3, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. You realize if he wanted to see one of these wives spend a day with each one of these wives, it would take him over 2.5 years to see every one of these ladies. Do you think there was ever a point where it's like, okay, well, number 400, that's going to be the one. I'm going to be good here. Seriously, wow. Yes.
I find it interesting that whenever you just asked that question, that there's probably other things he multiplied for himself. I find it interesting that that was the main thing that we have in Scripture, that the women would be the main thing. Because I do feel like that's one of man's men specifically,
Mhm.
that can just be one of their biggest temptations, and then the gold and the, like, I just find it interesting that those are the things that we have listed that
Right.
were specifically such a big thing to his downfall.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't know that there was ever somebody who had more wives. It seems like Solomon was almost trying to set a record here on this. I don't know, but, you know, God had warned him and said, look, this is going to be your downfall if you do this, right? Don't take women of these nations, and he still goes through with it. And it's no wonder that he turns away from God with that much negative influence and that much idolatrous, you know, beliefs within his own household. I think I had two here, Johnny and then Brandy.
I was just gonna say, back in chapter 3, it said that all the people still offered sacrifices in the high places.
Mhm.
It may have begun as a matter of convenience. These places were already here. We don't have a place designated yet, so it'll be all right to do it here. But then by the time we get here to chapter 11, it seems like they're probably still continuing that practice.
And if I remember correctly, the high place that was mentioned there in chapter 3 was actually one that, if I remember correctly, I'm thinking right off the top of my head, that one that Moses, was that one that, I believe that one was established, and that was a location that was good at the time, but it should have been removed after the fact. And it's almost like, okay, well, if we can go back and do it here, why not do it in other places kind of thing, I guess. Maybe so.
So, we know that David married foreign wives as well, but
Mhm.
they did not turn his heart from God. Do you think maybe that the warning specific to Solomon was because that would be his biggest weakness, were these wives and their ability to turn his heart from them?
Maybe. It could be, but then you have to wonder, okay, well, this is instruction. It was given not just for, this was given for the whole nation.
Right.
So God always knew that this would be a major problem for them, and it seems like it would have that kind of effect on just about anybody. You know, if they got themselves into that situation, it would start having that tug or that pull on them. Now, you take as many wives or concubines as he had, and it's almost inevitable that you're going to be pulled away or persuaded by that multitude, you know, of bad influence. David was weak, you know. The one thing, and I think it's kind of interesting, if y'all notice as we've read through, you keep having these little mentions of David again. Like, just these little subtle reminders that David was, you know, how we know him, man after God's own heart. Right? We're going to continue to see that, even when it gets to Solomon's, basically his, the justice that's going to be served. So I think it's kind of interesting that there's always that reminder. David had made a lot of mistakes, but he never let his heart turn away from God. And actually, Solomon somewhat's going to be spared in a sense on what punishment God wanted to bring to Solomon. He's going to say, but because of David your father, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to do this. Right? It's kind of interesting how all that plays out, but the big problem that we see coming into this is that these wives have turned his heart away. You know, it does not have to be a great multitude of wives. It does not have to be a great multitude of husbands. Say it was a queen and this was a number of husbands that had turned their heart away from God. It does not have to be a great number of people. It could very easily be a great number of things that we turn our hearts to. It could be people. How many people do you surround yourself with that are not godly focused people? What was Solomon doing? He was filling his entire house full of people who were idolatrous, practicing individuals, people who loved these foreign gods. He surrounded himself with that. I mean, he had to expect that problems were going to come. Just the same, you think about it in this sense today, who do we surround ourselves with? Who's our closest people? Do we surround ourselves with God-fearing, spiritual-minded people? Or do we leave from these four walls and surround ourselves with people of the world and accept that as our closest people? Who's going to have the greater influence, right? This was something that happened to him, but it's something we need to be careful. It doesn't have to be wives or husbands. Just people in general can turn us in the same sense. Yes, sir.
You would think that Solomon would be the one who would have all the sway over them. I mean, he's the king, and you would expect him, and probably going through his mind, just for him to think, well, they're not going to affect me in that way. If anything, I'll bring them to the truth, bring them to the right way. But, you know, we see it even in our own lives at times that that's generally not how it works out for us.
More often than not, it's the exact opposite. There may be good intention originally, but more often than not, it really kind of goes in the other direction. And maybe it was the case. Maybe Solomon had that in mind, like, well, I'll turn all these women to our belief and that kind of thing. And, well, if we look there at verse 4, it says, "For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods." And it's interesting that it throws in that little tidbit there. It was when he was old. Should we ever think that we have come to a point where we have made it? That we have attained it? Be foolish thinking, right? Yes.
Talking about Solomon and all of his women, I can't help but think about the Song of Solomon. And I'm probably missing something here. I don't want to, blaspheme the book or anything, but it's like you read Song of Solomon, but then you think about, he had hundreds and hundreds of women in his life. It's like, well, do you really think she's the most beautiful? Do you really love her as much as you're saying? And Song of Solomon, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to, think about Solomon's actual life and then read Song of Solomon and have it be sincere.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, okay, to which specific one were you talking about here, Solomon? Narrow it down for us, or, that kind of thing. But I see what you're saying, for sure. Being that, I don't know exactly how old he was here. We know we're getting to the latter part of his reign, but it says even when he was old, his wives turned his heart away after these other gods. And it says, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. And it keeps reminding us that, and I don't know if it's just by way of inspiration to give us those little subtle reminders, because David's relationship with God is going to be the very thing that saved Solomon from seeing all of the destruction of the kingdom right before his eyes. Basically, God's going to say, here's what I should do for you and this kingdom, but I'm not going to do it now. It's something that's going to happen to your children, not actually you, because of the relationship that David had with me, because of his good heart. I don't know if that's the reason it keeps dropping those little hints, but I think it might have something to do with it. Verse 5, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David." It provides us a little bit of specific detail as far as, some of these so-called gods of that time and who it was that some were worshiping during this time. And really what you kind of see in these first 6 verses is, okay, Solomon has all of these wives who practice in these things, and now Solomon is somewhat accepting of it, right? He's saying, okay, well, I will allow it. You're my wives. We're going to accept these things, and it's going to be okay. Something that is accepted even in our own lives, even if it's something that maybe we don't think, and I'm not saying this is a little thing by any means, but I want us to see kind of a bigger picture in this. If you think about one little thing maybe that you allow yourself to just be okay with as it pertains to Christianity today, one little thing that you might say, you know what, that's not that big of a deal. And then think about the impact that might have on the generation to come. This might not have been that big of a deal to Solomon, but we know the whole picture. We know what takes place in the years to come after this, and how one group's going to be led away, gone for good. The other group's going to be led away into captivity. All these things that are going to take place because of his decisions and bringing in so much idolatrous practice in this one little decision. He probably didn't think it was that big of a deal when he did it. You think about that maybe in today's sense and a little bit of practical application. Just take and say someone decides, you know what, it's not all that important for me to come to Sunday evening service. I go in the morning, I go and I worship God, and I'm there. Not that big of a deal if I go on Sunday evening. It may become the case where later they have the same thought about Wednesday and say, you know what, it's okay. I don't need that edification. I don't need that building up. I don't need that encouragement from my brethren. I'm good with just Sunday morning. And that becomes a habit. And then the generation who's watching them, the kids who are watching that and the decisions that are being made. It might be the case that once they reach adulthood, they say, you know what, it was kind of optional for these other 2 dates. Why can't I make it optional for this one? And you see the progression and how much worse it can begin to get. This little thing that he might not have thought was a big thing, it was a massive thing. And it's going to cause so much trouble and so much misery for this kingdom. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking of the grace of God, you know. We can look at, you know, a small thing, a large thing, but all of it is sin, and God stands in the way of that. But he also has that grace that keeps on going forward. And with Solomon, he sinned, and we all sin. And that's the main thing. We all sin, and it all comes back to the grace of God.
That's right.
And the promise that was made to Abraham. So it has to keep going, and that's the reason why anyone can be saved.
Right.
God opened the door, and no matter how big, you know, Solomon, we said, done the biggest, you could say. But God's grace is still there.
Right.
Still saving.
It brings up
and we still moving forward.
right. Brings up a good question to ask. Was he beyond a point where God would forgive him?
No.
Absolutely not. Right? And he's done a lot of wrong here, but he was not beyond a point of where God would forgive him.
And I think that's the reason too why you see Pharaoh's daughter in that. You know, we say, well, Egypt, you know, Pharaoh, you know, they was backed out and everything, but God's grace was still with Egypt, and people could still be saved, you know, even though they had did a great injustice toward God's people. But God's grace was still there.
Yeah, God's grace is extended to all who will be obedient unto him. And, it, you know, even in this, Solomon has done a whole lot of wrong here.
We limit that grace though. We take it and we just suck it into ourselves.
Right.
And it's not that way.
Right.
God's grace has always been there. You know.
Yeah.
That scripture, I don't exactly know what it said, but it said one died for all, then we're all dead. But, you know, sometimes we look at it and go, well, that's not me.
Right.
I'm a little more ahead of that, you know. I got it better. You know, you don't have it better.
No, we're all absolutely hopeless without the grace of God. We have absolutely nothing without his grace.
And,
You know, it's,
we can't dine them too much because we all in that same boat.
yes, yes. I think the magnitude and why it's so important to really kind of stress what, you know, Solomon's mistakes here is because of how great of an impact they had on everybody else. He was the king. He was leading God's people, and he was the one who would wind up bringing in all of this idolatry. And we'll get to it we'll get to it on Wednesday. We're going to go ahead and get ready to wrap up this evening. But, you know, he starts by accepting it. And what we're going to see in the upcoming verses is that he then begins to help promote it. And he actually begins to help build these altars for this idolatrous practice. So it goes far beyond him just saying, okay, well, this is not so bad, I'm going to accept it, but even to the point where he assists in it and helping them to have this location and giving a longevity to these practices. But, you know, here's the thought just to get ready to close up. Do you think it would have made any difference whatsoever when they came into the promised land if they would have just done what God had asked them originally? Right? We went back and we read some of those verses out of Deuteronomy where they were supposed to go into that land and they were to rid it of all of these nations, rid it of all of this idolatrous practice and worship and all of these things. Do you think it would have made a difference if they would have just got that out of the way from the get-go? You know, you tie that all the way then to Solomon and him allowing this little bit to take a foothold and how great of a problem it's going to become in the long run. We got to ask ourselves at the end of the day, and this may be small application in comparison to the big things we're seeing here, But even a little bitty thing in our lives, even something very small that we say, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. You know what, it'll be okay. I can accept this one thing. It's not that bad. Any sin that we accept into our lives, we are trying to separate and drive a wedge between us and God if we continue to live in that sin. Any little thing, we need to make sure we're pushing it far from us. Because we don't have the foresight. We don't have the knowledge to know how far down the snowball effect could go. As we get ready to close this evening, if you do have these small things, what seem as insignificant in your life, then maybe you're not all that bad in your own mind, but you know that they are wrong. Take the opportunity to make that right. Take the opportunity to say, you know what, no more. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to allow it. I'm not going to stand for it, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem in the moment. Do what you have to do to get your relationship with God right. If you have any need, please let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.